Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the University of Missouri St. Louis. This is the SGA Chambers, our Student Government Association Chambers, and we're really pleased to be able to use that today because our originally scheduled room absolutely would not fit. So that's a wonderful thing. And I know we have many people on virtual as well. So good evening or good morning. Last night I did something as well. I'm Kristen Solik. I'm chancellor here at the University of Missouri St. Louis, and it really is my pleasure to welcome you here to the first 1963 Legacy Society lecture of this calendar year. 1963 is important because that is, of course, the birthday of our founding, and we are 60 years old this year. And in fact, September 15th is our date. We're going to be celebrating with a year-long activities in the academic 23-24 calendar year. So I know you'll be seeing and hearing more about this as we move forward. Now, members of the 1963 Legacy Society are those alumni and friends who have invested in the university's future through their estate or planned gifts. So a very special welcome to those society members who are here with us today, either in person or again virtually. These lifelong learning lectures are sponsored by the 1963 Legacy Society, which is led by Elizabeth Niven, Senior Director of Planned Giving. Wave, Elizabeth. So the next seminar will focus on family business transition plans. The 1963 Legacy Society takes its name from the year of the university's founding, as I had indicated. Now, it gives me great pleasure today to introduce our first Legacy Society speaker, Charlie Allen. He is a native of St. Louis. Charlie studied Russian language, literature, and history at Dartmouth College and then at Harvard University before joining Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty in 1980, where he worked in Paris in the Audience Research Division for 9 years. Wow, Charlie. While an undergraduate at Dartmouth, Mr. Allen enrolled in advanced Russian language study courses at Leningrad State University. After obtaining a Master's of Business degree in France, Mr. Allen joined Bunge, a global food and agribusiness firm in which he held a variety of international roles, both in Europe and in the United States, from 1981 until his retirement in 2018. Mr. Allen is the author of several articles and translations, and he remains active in regional and national Slavic studies organizations. He currently teaches 20th century Russian literature at the Honors College here at the university. He is a member of the Chancellor's Council, where he serves proudly on the Educational Relevancy Committee. I consider Charlie a scholar, a wonderful human being, and a friend. So I am so pleased to introduce and welcome Charlie to speak about what he is most passionate and knowledgeable about. Charlie.
Thank you. Are we good? Very good. Yep. Well, thank you, Kristen, for the introduction. I have to say, my relationship with UMSL means a great deal to me. Since moving back to the United States in 2014, I've deepened my relationship with UMSL, and it's been a very important thing for me in life. And I just want to say, Kristen, how lucky we are to have you, the leader, and you, the human being, at the helm. I feel we're very, very fortunate about that. So today, you're going to get my view of what we might want to keep in mind about what's happening in Ukraine. I'm going to come clean in the beginning. I don't speak Ukrainian, okay? I am a teacher of literature. I'm not a specialist on military strategy and other things. And I approach this as a generalist. And everything you're going to see here is a result of consulting open sources. There's nothing mysterious or difficult to find in any of this. I will share one piece of classified information, and that is I started studying Russian, it kind of scares me to say this, in 1968 in middle school. So it is a lasting passion in my life. So let's dive in. So, title, Ukraine, its history, its people, and why Putin invaded it. Let's review a little bit of history. And I'm sorry if some of this is already familiar to you, but I want to give an overview of what I think is the essential information. So, map of Ukraine. Again, the southern areas, if we look at the Crimea and the eastern regions, are where the Russians are installed, okay, where they are digging in and trying to advance, with Kiev further north, and then western Ukraine being historically part of Poland for a while, with its own history. So, one point I hope everyone in this room accepts is Ukraine is not Russia, despite what some are bandying around. And keep in mind, there was no such thing as Russia or Ukraine even 300 years ago. And okay, we had the Christianization of the region starting allegedly about the year 1000, but in fact, there's probably half a millennium during which there was almost no interplay between, let's just say, northern and southern groups, all right? Certainly, Kiev and Moscow were not in regular contact because Moscow did not exist early on. And so this weird version of history that Moscow has sort of had the baton passed to it, okay, from Kiev is a complete distortion. And it's what suits Mr. Putin. Keep in mind that parts of Ukraine were in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and also in the Russian Empire, particularly the last, let's say, but starting in the 16th century. And it is true that as part of those empires, many people spoke Polish, many people spoke Russian, but we must keep in mind that the southern Slavs and the northern Slavs were pretty separate, okay? And there was such a thing starting in the 18th century as Ukrainian national consciousness. Now, that's a recent thing in general in human history, but there was definitely, by the end of the 18th century, and certainly in the 19th century, a Ukrainian awareness of national identity. And in the 19th century, there was a rise of Ukrainian pride in the culture. Very important Ukrainian writers were making their way, and strong intellectual movements against the Tsar, which were quite vibrant in the 19th century. And when the revolution came in the early 20th century, Ukraine did its best to break away. And there were several governments that came in and out of power until the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was formed in 21. And 22, the USSR was created, Ukrainian Republic, Socialist Republic was formalized, but it had been a rough path. So the Soviet period, what do we want to keep in mind here, all right? No region in the former USSR or this part of the world suffered as many losses as Ukraine. Stalin's forced famine to starve peasants, okay, and entrench his power, killed millions of people. Then Ukraine is occupied by the German army during World War II, and no question that this part of the former USSR lost more people than anywhere else. It was also, by the way, the seat of the Soviet military-industrial complex. Most of the really sensitive military hardware was manufactured in Ukraine during the USSR's existence. Post-Soviet Ukraine. Ukraine declared independence, 1991, first opportunity. And it is fair to say the first decade was rough, very rough. Questions of corruption, questions of democracy, fair elections, all the things which new governments face without a lot of experience being independent, they were major issues. We had two factions basically competing for power, the pro-Moscow and the pro-Ukrainian faction. You all probably remember the President Yanukovych, pro-Moscow. He did not accept the Ukrainian decision to try to join NATO and to try to join the EU. He fled, all right? And since then, we've had Ukrainian presidents, pro-Ukrainian presidents only. 2014, Russia invades Crimea. And as a result, the Ukrainian constitution is amended saying our intention is to join the EU and NATO. And Zelensky was elected in 2019. So I would say the first 10 years were a tough story. The last 20 years have been more encouraging. The trend is favorable, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. By the way, Zelensky himself was much less popular before the war started than even Joe Biden was at his worst polling, okay? Zelensky was a complete political in the doghouse until this war struck. And he was seen as kind of, some might have called him even a buffoon. Even when he's president, sure. Until this war hit, he was not polling well, he was not earning a lot of support. So what's behind this invasion? What do we think is driving this? Why was Putin so aggressive now at this point? So he's been seething, he and the Russian population have been seething about the lack of respect from the West, that they're treated like a gas station with nuclear weapons, all right, and no more, all right? A lot of people feel that, okay? And one example that I'd forgotten about was when George Bush Jr. came to meet with Putin, I think it was 2005 or 2006, Putin wanted him to come to the Kremlin to hold the meeting, and Bush insisted that they just meet at the airport. And that really stung. That's an example in Putin and the Russians' mind of the West not taking Russia seriously, not treating it as a legitimate power. Putin has also been devoting huge resources to military. Let's just see what we can do with them. Just like some people who want to drive that nice new sports car they've bought, it was time for him to show what he had. It is no question that the Russian-Chinese relationship has been deepening recently. The question is, did Putin feel like he had to prove something to the Chinese, okay? Or did he simply feel he was more empowered as a relationship with the Chinese? There are various points of view on that, but there's no question that the closer relationship with China made this easier for him to do. And having seen Chechnya, Syria, okay, Crimea, the war in Georgia, every time a conflict came up that he helped to incite, the West did not react very effectively. So in his mind, the trend is his friend, okay? He's going to get away with something, and he was convinced, after watching things for decades, the West is in decline, that NATO, all it does is squabble. It's not an effective alliance anymore, all right? And that democracies, in his view, are weak, they're indecisive, and they lack, above all, staying power. And that, he thinks, is going to play to his benefit. So, what did he try to accomplish with this? So, some pretty obvious things, I think. He wants to decouple the US from NATO. He wants to make it clear that he never approved of NATO expansion with many of the former Soviet republics, all right? Above all, nothing is worse in his mind than a good democracy next door and a confederation of democracies, the EU, which is prospering. So how to destabilize all that would suit him just fine. But the most important reason, and I'll be emphasizing this a lot in my talk, is he wants to integrate Ukraine into the Russian world, Ruski Mir, all right, which is a de facto Holy Slavic Alliance, all right? And drawing on some historical roots, which I'll talk about a little bit. So, see the man up there in the corner? Looks like he'd be a count at a reception, about to take a glass of champagne, right? Ivan Ilyin. Ivan Ilyin, and I don't like to use this word lightly, is really a Christian fascist philosopher, all right? He was expelled in 1922, died in the West, all right? His philosophy revolves around the thought that Russia was exploited by the West, taken advantage of, all right? Damaged by these crummy ideas like democracy, communism, he would attribute to the West. All our garbage comes from you guys. We need a strong Orthodox Church, an unflinching leader, all right, who's going to attack these horrible Western institutions so that a proud Russia, okay, can reassert itself. That's his deal. His body was brought back in 2009 from Switzerland. All of his personal papers were shipped back from Michigan State University. And Putin talks regularly about Ilyin as an important influence. And just a few select quotes from Ilyin. Freedom is knowing your place, right? We're all just a part of a body and an organism that we don't choose and we don't question. World needs redemption from unsoiled Russia. The world is an aborted process, and there is no such thing as a factual world. So Timothy Snyder, I don't know if any of you know him, he's a Yale historian. He's written a lot about this conflict. I love his quote, Ilyin made of lawlessness a virtue so pure as to be invisible, and so absolute as to demand the destruction of the West. So, on my Radio Liberty days, we had a broadcaster in the Russian department who was consistently called on policy violations in his broadcasts. I can't remember what they were, but they got him in trouble. And I've since found out that guy was a follower of Ilyin, whom I hadn't heard of then, okay? Then we have this other thing, Eurasianism. I don't know if you've heard about this, a little bit written about it. It was an early 20th century movement, basically founded by by emigres from the first wave after the revolution, saying, we can build a nice big tent for all concerned under the Orthodox banner, okay? Democracy is not our deal. We need to go toward a more patronymic, sort of Orthodox structure. Eurocentrism is a mistake, all right? Yes, Ukrainian culture is a subset of that, but there was really a view here for Turkic and other Asian cultures to be part of it. So it was a somewhat welcoming vision. What we have up here is Mr. Dugin. Do you remember the woman who was blown up in her car? That was his daughter about half a year ago. She's a big advocate of the same thing, okay? What Dugin has done is he's weaponized this, totally perverting it, saying Western decadence has to be erased. The Atlantic world, led by the US, okay, is out for us. We have to do a continuation of World War II full-time against Western corruption. And we won World War II, let's not make any mistake about it, not the West. So, rough stuff. And these two schools of thought are like a car idling in the garage, all right? It's just part of the environment that people grow accustomed to, and they have some resonance in Russian history, let's face it. So they lead into this Russian historical narrative, and this you'll run into with almost everyone you meet from over there. We were invaded, the Mongols, Napoleon, the Nazis. The heroic Russian people fought them off, okay, all right? We can only deal with these kind of threats if we have a strong man and we're going to fulfill our greatness, okay? We have to be strong politically, militarily, etc. And it's true. Many Russians, very liberal-minded Russians, will say to you, democracy stuff, it's not going to work here. We need someone with an iron fist. And this narrative really is something that almost all Russians can identify with to some extent. But what Mr. Putin is doing is he's escalating the narrative. And probably the biggest expert in the world on historical narrative, and particularly as it pertains to Russia, is Jim Wirch, who's at Washington University, okay? And he's talked about how Putin has started with this standard Russian historical view, and then he's leveraged it in a way. If we talk in baseball about juicing the ball, here we're talking about juicing the narrative, okay? Juicing the narrative to our benefit. So I mentioned the Russian world, the Ruski Mir narrative, all right? We always included many other peoples. They were all part of our civilization. They were taken away from us. It's the West that's trying to fracture that. But they're part of this big family, and we know it. History will prove it. Well, that didn't quite get him far enough. So he's up to the ante now and said, we are a bulwark against these crummy Western values: democracy, weakness, okay, rights. All people do is protest about their rights. And we are in many ways the third Rome. That's a theme in Russian history. Rome, Constantinople failed. Finally, in Moscow, we got a true religion that's pure. And so our goal is an ongoing battle with liberal democracy. Now that's a step forward. That's being aggressive. That's not just defending Russia, which was the normal historical narrative we talked about. This is escalating that seriously. And Putin is a master storyteller, a master of narrative, all right? I talked about, yes, there are threads here from the Russian past that make sense to people, okay? But he also embellishes these things with stories about himself. His brother who died during the war, hardship the family underwent. We don't know if those are true, but certainly one of the things he emphasizes is, I love history. I'm an expert in history. As far as we can tell, he was a very undistinguished student through most of life. But now he's this great modern day historian, all right? And he knows he's very skillful at crafting a narrative to suit his purposes, depending on the context. Fiona Hill, the big Russia expert, who you may have heard testifying a couple of years ago, said when Putin came to visit Bush Jr. on his ranch, all he could talk about was his baptism, his mother praying, his grandmother praying at home, the icons that he grew up with. He wove this very compelling story that I think triggered that comment that Bush made that people never let him live down. You know, I saw into his soul or whatever. And again, he was very convincing. And his story to Russia is, you remember the 90s, Gorbachev, Yeltsin, that was chaos. That was weakness, okay? We need stability, okay? And we need to stop the West from co-opting the Russian world, from intervening in Ukraine and trying to contaminate it with its values. So bottom line, this is really the bottom message that comes. Russia must fight to exist and to counter Western meddling and moral rot. We are rotten, and no one criticizes LGBTQ rights more than Putin. He absolutely goes on a tear about it every time he can. To him, that's the ultimate example of how we've lost total control, all perspective on rights. We just spend our time protesting. So, this messianic nationalism, okay, what did Kierkegaard say? We live our life forwards and understand it backwards. If we go and look at these events, we can kind of see a pattern here, which a few people picked up, but we didn't really understand it, broadly speaking. So Dugin's first book came out actually when Yeltsin was still in power. All about Eurasianism, but not the Eurasianism that was originally intended. It's his version of Eurasianism. 2007, new fund created by Putin, the Ruski Mir Fund. Now, what would that purpose of that be? To get us thinking about this extended Russian tent, okay, that we need to control. 2009, Ilin's body is brought back. The Tver Museum is about World War II and talks about the sufferings and the challenges of the war. But it's increasingly, it was founded in the late 90s, but it's increasingly focused on the greatness of Stalin and his achievements and the importance of strong leadership. And all the polling indicates today that Stalin, who under Khrushchev and even Brezhnev to an extent was viewed as the ultimate villain, he's now he's getting more popular. He's seen as a good guy. you know, and the state, they always say in Russian, "Это не случилось бы при Сталине." This wouldn't be happening under Stalin, okay? And so it's building, okay? The Cathedral of Russian Armed Forces has been built in the Moscow Oblast, all glorification of the military past, huge place, meant to be very impressive. And then in 2021, Mr. Putin, the historian, wrote an article on the historical unity of Russia and Ukraine, right? On the historical unity. What does that formulation suggest? It's established fact, right? There's nothing to contest in that. That's a very controversial statement, okay? Historians would pick that apart no end. But the title itself suggests where he's heading. And in parallel, and this is my old world, at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and the Gorbachev era particularly, we saw the impact of Western broadcasting outside influences, okay, foreign influences on people's opinions. It's been an absolute crackdown in independent media, starting really since Yeltsin left power, okay? And the view is that liberal media helped Yeltsin get elected in '96. Let's not happen that again. So once Putin got in power, the large media groups were acquired either by oligarchs who were close to Putin or government agencies. What is the state gas company doing buying a television network, okay? It's all a way, and they were forced sales, okay? It's all a way for them to control things. More and more laws about domestic content. So the BBC, Voice of America, Deutsche Welle, they could no longer meet the domestic content requirement. I'm not sure quite what it was. So they could no longer broadcast via radio. They basically had to turn either to television, which was heavily regulated, or the internet. So Radio Free Europe, in fact, Radio Liberty, that's almost a misnomer now, right? RIA Novosti was a reasonably independent news network. That was disbanded at Putin's request. Then laws start accelerating. Bloggers, bad. Control of the internet. And you've probably been hearing about the 100 or more laws that have been passed, prohibiting people from protesting, prohibiting people from talking about the war, prohibiting from even using certain words have been banned from the dictionary. Can't say that anymore. So this, in parallel with this messianic nationalism, makes for a very rough cocktail. And let's give Putin some credit here. He has pivoted very intelligently. Think about it. He has actually turned his back. He's actually ignored certain aspects of the Soviet legacy. For example, all right? In the USSR, all the republics were equal. So the Ukrainian Republic was equal to the Russian Republic, all right? Now, they all should learn Russian so they could talk to each other, but there was a sense of equality in this socialist brotherhood, all right? Now, Putin's saying, the dominant country is Russia. Russia's leading the way. Russia's at the helm, right? That's a complete disavowal of many of the concepts that were promoted under the USSR. And then the other thing, what we were saying before, democracy was a disaster for us. Look at what a laughingstock we became under Gorbachev and Yeltsin. They brought us chaos, not progress, all right? But above all, religion is our partner. The Orthodox Church is our friend, and there's a huge amount of soft power that he derives from that. In an atheist country, the church was, not only were churches torn down, the church was treated as a sort of a joke almost, except during the war when Stalin leveraged it a bit. Now the church is a full partner of Putin, okay? And all his propaganda and his policies. Another difference from the USSR, you read a lot about the people who've left. The skilled technical people, the skilled financial people, the people with business savvy, they're leaving. And in Putin's mind, good riddance. In fact, he has open borders. In the Soviet era, to go abroad was a pretty big deal, and typically you had a family member stay back so you wouldn't defect, all right? Putin couldn't care less. They want to leave, good riddance. If we're even losing our good technical talent, fine. I have other things on my mind. So let's look at the Ukrainian perspective. So what's their historical narrative, right? So we're a free-loving nation, right? All right? Free-spirited peasants. They don't use the word much now because there's a bit of controversy, but the sort of Cossack tradition is the kind of thing they're drawing on often. We've been attacked and abused by outsiders regularly, all right? They wouldn't say it's always been Russia, but it's often been Russia. But what they will say is Russia has now been showing for several decades it does not accept our sovereignty, all right? And so we have to fight, we have to stand up, okay? Our autonomy is at risk. And remember what I said, despite all the challenges that Ukraine has faced since independence, the trends are favorable. It is becoming a better and better democracy. That has to worry Putin. He doesn't want to see that next door. Now, if you're Ukrainian too, you think of, hey, there are a couple of treaties back there you guys signed, all right? Now, that's a memorandum. The first one, the Budapest Memorandum. Which, remember I said to you before, Ukraine was where a lot of the really sensitive Soviet military-industrial complex was located. Well, when the Soviet Union fell apart, the question was, what do we do about the nuclear weapons that are there? Kazakhstan and Belarus also had some. So there was a treaty signed where all those countries gave up their nuclear weapons, okay, and said no coercion would be used, okay, against them, against Ukraine or Kazakhstan. In other words, we respect that you're giving up your weapons. We're not going to come attack you now. That's a memorandum. But then there's a treaty of friendship directly between Russia and Ukraine, all right? 3 years later, we respect existing borders. There's a no invasion clause, which both of them signed, okay? Well, after 2014, that was made a joke of. And so the treaty was up for renewal every 10 years. Does it surprise you that Ukraine did not renew that in 2019? So from the Ukrainian point of view, we got rid of our nukes, okay? You signed a treaty saying you'd respect our borders. Now you, the nuclear superpower, just come in. And I think we all know what happened on February 20th, 2014. Crimea, many of the original soldiers masked. So where do I think we are now, okay? Where do I think we are now? This is discouraging, but this seems to be confirmed by everybody. The Russian outrage is not about this war being waged. It's about it being waged poorly, all right? From the Russian point of view, NATO is just trying to muscle Russia out of the way through Ukraine. It's just a proxy, okay? And who's getting our Russian soldiers killed? It's the American weapons which are taking them out. The US has blood on its hands for the Russian soldiers who are dying. Then there's a feeling like, this can't be going this badly. Someone has given an order not to fight all out. We should be winning this. There are only 40 million of them, 145 million of us. Come on. Who's responsible for ammunition and supplies? Unacceptable. And we know that Ukrainians have been very organized in getting IDs from dead Russian soldiers. It's very easy to find telephone information, and they're actually calling families of dead Russian soldiers, Ukrainians, saying, hey, do you know your son was killed? Do you know what happened? And the reaction, what we hear is the Russians take great umbrage that they're calling and said they fought for a great cause. And so the feeling is, now maybe not in Moscow, but we can't judge by Moscow. Do we really judge the US by New York? Okay. All right. So maybe in Moscow, people wouldn't respond that way. But in the Russian countryside, the support, I think, is very solid. Okay. There is a semi-independent network called Telegram. Telegram is basically a bunch of military bloggers commenting on the state of the war. And the picture they paint is of a war that should be going much better, that could be fought more effectively, and that the Russian government better get its act together. So all the pressure is from the right. It's not toward ending the war. And I remind you, this is in a context where very few people have access to foreign media of any kind. Yes, if you have a VPN, you can connect, and Radio Liberty, BBC, and Voice of America, Deutsche Welle, Voice of America, they all have websites, temporary websites that you can connect to until the Russian government shuts them down. Then you have to go to the other website to get other information. But you have to be motivated. You already have to be questioning the war to do that. And I don't think that's happening much outside Moscow and St. Petersburg. So the Putin lens, it's Putin's view that for the time being prevails in the population. So there's no popular outrage about this war. Okay, here I'm really getting outside my expertise. We do know that the American weapon systems have really helped Ukraine not only stay in the war, but in many places really turn the tide, okay? I'd never heard of the HIMARS before, okay? Javelins, HIMARS, Switchblades, the TB2 drones. A point to be made is we are not yet giving the Ukrainians our best javelins. They got medium quality javelins. The HIMARS that the Ukrainians are getting are not the ones with the longest trajectory or the most firepower, okay? TB2 drones, I think, are Turkish, not super advanced, but they're getting the job done. But one point to keep in mind is what we have shared with the Ukrainians so far is not our very best stuff. And it's still making a difference, all right? Then we have on the horizon Leopard tanks. How many? I keep trying to count. It doesn't seem to get to be a huge number, but they should be there quickly. Patriot missiles, Abrams tanks, those are going to take, I gather, maybe 3 to 6 months to train people properly so they can use them, all right? They'll add to it a big advantage by then, but they're not going to happen right away, all right? So could be late 2023 before we see what the latest weapons that have been approved, what impact they can have. But I would say this to you. This is a question, the military question, that I'd love to have a really qualified person answer. Even if we gave the Ukrainians the best stuff here, and even if we got approval for the F-16s, which so far looks like it's not going to happen. I think it's Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, who's opposing that. I don't know that. But even if we gave them all that stuff, could we really expel the Russians completely from Ukraine without using NATO forces? And my feeling is no. I don't think we have enough to get them out. Maybe we could get them out of eastern Ukraine, but Crimea too, I think it's a tall order, okay? That's a very tall order without involving NATO, and we all know the risks of that. But these are the different systems. There's the Javelin, I think that HIMARS there, that's a Patriot, and that's, I think, the Abrams tanks. The Abrams tanks apparently take the longest to train people for. The good Abrams tanks. So we talked before also about who's leaving. Well, 8.1 million people have gone west so far, all right? We don't know how many of them are the really educated tech people, because look at how much Russian technical competence has helped Silicon Valley, how much it helps Israel. We have a lot of very skilled technical people in Russia. At least 500,000 have left, all right? What's the impact of that? Not very big, except on the battlefield. I think the Russian army really is hurting without better chips. And is this where China can help them get around some things? It's come up lately. What would Chinese military aid look like? That's the question, but we're seeing such poor performance on the battlefield technically. I have to believe the chips are a big factor. And then, remember we were reading? These sanctions are going to be so brutal, the Russian economy won't come back to its 2021 level for 30 years. You know what? It only contracted 2 to 3%. So the catastrophe which was projected did not happen. I don't think the average Russian is feeling so much pain from this yet that in any way that's damaging Putin politically. I just don't see it. And we have to put ourselves in the position of Russians who are used to a lot more hardship than we are, all right? So we don't have McDonald's anymore. We have a crummy Russian alternative. We can't have Western cars anymore. There'll be crummy Russian-style cars. Okay, so be it. In case I had any illusion about the Russians' ability to withstand horrible things, remember, I teach literature. So I got an anthology out of poems written during the blockade of Leningrad. 1 million people died, right? Huge. Germans surrounded them for, it's called 1,000 days. It's the 900 days, excuse me, is the book. So I open the anthology. The first poem I come to, and these are all people who died during the blockade, and these were poems that were found afterwards, all right? Poets you've never heard of, right? The first poem I come to is called Cat Roast, okay? As a reminder to me, they can take a lot, and I don't think they're feeling. And frankly, the economic dimension is not a factor at all for Putin. Okay, I don't think he cares. I don't think in any way this invasion was an attempt to distract people from economic decline or economic problems. It's not even on his radar. You could say Putin in many ways is a medieval warlord. If you know Masha Gessen, she writes a lot on Russia. Ex-Radio Liberty, by the way. She's called Putin the man who left time in history. He's in another place. And if you look at what he talks about, he's not talking much about the Soviet era. He even goes before Peter the Great. He goes before the 18th century. He flips back to medieval Russia and other times. He's seeing continuity, historical continuity and destiny that way precedes a time when any of the people in his own country lived. It's part of his mantle, okay? All right, I bet you want to know what I think here, and of course I don't know any more than anyone else, okay? I've shared with you one piece of classified information, that's all I can. What do I think? Okay, long game, right? Do I think we'll have a lecture like this in a year, or that the war will be relevant in a year? I'm afraid I think it probably will be, all right? What are Putin's advantages, okay? He's accountable to no one. If he's feeling any pressure, it's from the right, but the head of his security detail, the Minister of the Interior, the Minister of Defense, they all report to each other. They are his closest confidants. He's not in any physical danger. And as I've tried to point out, the Russian public is behind him here so far, right? Can anyone think of who could succeed him? I know experts in the country who can't come up with a name. One was Shoigu initially, Minister of Defense. He hasn't looked too good the last year, okay? So he's probably not there. It's not even a successor in sight. Again, the economic piece he doesn't care about, and he has no moral scruples. Who bombs kindergartens? Who bombs convoys of refugees with their pets, okay? Who does these kinds of things? He finds a new moral low all the time, and I'm convinced he will commit even bigger atrocities going forward. And there he has, in one sense, an advantage, okay? If I had to predict where will the new atrocity come, I'm very fearful about these filtration centers. You've been reading about these? So these are citizens from Ukraine. Many of them are children and orphans. Some are ordinary citizens. We know that 2 million people have gone from Ukraine to Russia. Maybe many of them are sympathizers with Putin, but there are other people who are caught up in war who went there. And the Russians had done this in the Chechnya War too. Can they, in some way, exploit these citizen hostages in new and horrible ways in the coming year? I'm afraid that might be what we see. Okay, this is the easier part to talk about NATO's advantage. And again, I think we talk about the US, but we want to talk about NATO. Because one of the best things to come out of this is we've never seen NATO more united. We've never seen Western democracies talking to each other more, all right? NATO's equipment's working. They have a huge technical advantage. Their military is functional. Their soldiers are trained. It's awful to read about these new Russian recruits, how little training they have, the losses in the battlefield, just the absolute slaughter that Putin's indifferent to. Maybe over time, those can be a factor working against him. I don't know. I don't see it yet. The Afghan war was a big factor in the collapse of the Soviet Union. 15,000 casualties. We're at maybe 200,000 dead and wounded Russians. We don't see any slippage yet in the support, really. So unfortunately, I think the absence of foreign radio and everything, the absence of an alternative gives Putin an advantage here. Our intelligence is good. I have never seen the Russians on the back foot as much as they were in the lead up to the war, when we were going to the world saying, this is going to happen, that's going to happen. They didn't know how to react. And I'm personally convinced that wasn't just technical analysis. I think we had some human assets too, who were confirming this is going to happen. You've got to be ready, all right? I don't think they have assets even remotely as good. And did anyone see the article recently about how, with all the Russians being pushed out of Western Europe, diplomats, all kinds of people having trouble keeping their status, the Russians just simply have fewer agents out in the West to collect information. Field communication is terrible. I also have to believe that in Western countries, intelligence is serious. It's brought honestly to leadership, and that in the West we're capable of learning from mistakes. I'm not sure how straight the intelligence Putin is getting, and I'm not sure, in fact, I'm pretty sure he can't learn from mistakes. He is bent on this vision, and we come back to the atrocities. The atrocities, I'm sorry to say, are going to continue. They'll boggle the mind. My thought is, they'll keep us focused on how important it is to continue fighting this war, all right? But make no doubt, if this goes on, it's going to be harder and harder for Western governments to justify the sacrifices that are being made. Okay, what do I see in the next 12 months? Okay, Q3, Q4, we're going to see the Russians really being routed militarily. I think it's going to be just awful. But that does not mean they can be expelled from all of Ukraine. I want to believe the NATO commitment is not going to waver. I'm actually a little more worried about here than I am in Europe right now. Europe is on board. It's next door. It's become very real for them. It has woken up Europe and the European partners in NATO in a way that has been really helpful. Russia is not going to de-escalate under Putin under any circumstances, and he is not going to resign. He will die with his boots on. He's not going to give up power. Is he in physical danger? I think not. All right. If he goes, who knows what's coming? Fiona Hill, the same Russia expert I quoted before, was asked, could there be another Gorbachev if Putin dies? Like Gorbachev really took Brezhnev's place. There were a couple of people after him, but it was really the successor to Brezhnev was Gorbachev. And she said, I can't rule it out. But unfortunately, Russians are not as aware of alternatives as they were. I've been repeating this. As they were in the 80s. They don't have as many sources of information. Just as we saw this messianic narrative getting juiced up, we also saw the closing of media, the closing of information, the control of protests, television, radio, everything. So that's a very concerning thing. 3 days ago, Michael McFaul, the former ambassador, wrote an article about why we have to fight this war. Okay? I hope all of you will read that, because he makes it very clear. Not only is China watching to see how we do this, because a lot of people are saying we should be focusing on China. What are we wasting our time on here? We also have essentially reunited Europe militarily in a way that couldn't have happened before. And I think the term that's being used is we have some offshore soldiers fighting the war for us. It's the Ukrainians doing the real fighting, okay? So we're reinforcing Europe. Europe so far hasn't had to take any hits. Also, what does it do to the international order to see a neighboring country disavow another country's sovereignty after it signed a treaty with them, take it over, and essentially commit, I don't think this is an exaggeration, essentially committing genocide on the Ukrainian people? How can we think that's in our interest to allow that to happen? So I guess I'd finish with this thought, This war has to be fought. Putin's counting on us not to have staying power, okay? And I have to believe all of us today are Ukrainians, whether we think it or not. We're all Ukrainians now. Okay, okay, all right. Anyway, so that's it. Those are my comments. Questions and answers, questions? Starting in the room.
I'm going to let you get the call on people, and then I'll repeat it for the people at home.
Okay, I'll start over here, left to right. Yes. Yeah, it's not rational at all. I mean, as someone has said.
Hey, Charlie, can you repeat a little bit?
Question is, yes, thank you. Question is, so he wins this war, he gets this totally destroyed country, okay, that doesn't want him there. What the hell is he gaining from this, okay? The only answer I can give to that is, he is not a rational post-Enlightenment actor. Remember I talked about, you have to go way back in history to find someone like him. So the whole economic piece, the whole realistic piece is missing. I can't see what he would get. It's what you're saying, but you're right. I think I used the term, oh yeah. So is he making this up as he goes along? I think to a bit. When I talk about juicing the narrative, that's not where he started. So he escalated the narrative for his purposes. Yeah. Yeah.
Unfortunately, I see this off as one-sided.
Okay.
You're 100% for people. He's an evil guy, and you're 100% right in everything that he's done.
Right.
You say that Gorbachev was drunk, had chaos, and weak, and they absolutely were, and the rest took full advantage of it. Gorbachev was an idiot to give up all his buffer zones in the east for nothing. Now I heard that Reagan promised him to either disband NATO or at least stop expanding NATO.
Yeah.
Which they didn't do.
Yeah.
They keep encroaching upon Russia, encroaching upon Russia, encroaching upon Russia until they force them in the war. Ukraine is right on their border. What would we do if somebody right on our border did that to us? We are not really right here. And by the way, I do not believe that Zelensky is a Democrat, is democracy. What did he do when he got elected? He got elected by a landslide. Most of which because he said he would make peace with Russia. As soon as he got in there, he started picking on Russia. He got us to help him. He's corrupt. He's a dictator just as much as Putin is. First thing he did is put his major competitor in jail.
Charlie, I'm gonna ask you.
Yeah, so
Charlie.
You are basically promoting propaganda under the thinly veiled cover of some type of knowledge that you have. You are not saying a so-called story. This is propaganda. This is not fact.
okay.
Hey, Charlie, I'm going to let Charlie recapitulate that somehow.
Okay. Let me just summarize here. Okay. So you're saying I'm giving a one-sided view. You're not. We're not recognizing the problems of Zelensky in Ukraine, and that we would be doing the same thing if we had same. Yeah. So there was a big debate when NATO was being expanded as to whether that was provocative or helpful. Okay. Okay. Most people in that debate, and it was surprising actually, there were people, it was surprising who came down on what side of that. Most people came down saying, every time we look at Russian history, when there's a move toward liberalization, liberalization dies. It never wins. Okay. And so we're safer. Where would we be today if we didn't have NATO, I guess is the answer.
What did we do? Okay. We expanded our influence.
Okay, we didn't invade anybody. Okay. Yeah, all right. So just to say that, the United States isn't innocent in this, and we're promoting our own agenda here. Okay. All right, here. Yes.
understanding that in Berlin Wall fell,
Yeah.
that Putin was a KGB general.
Right.
And he also,
Not in Berlin. He was elsewhere. I think he was Potsdam. I'm not sure. Anyway.
he also and in other words, stop the exodus from
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
using
Okay, so question is, Putin was assigned to Potsdam as the wall came down. Do we know whether he tried to stop people from leaving, right, forcibly? Okay, I don't know the answer to that. There's a lot of stuff said on both sides about that phase of Putin's life. We don't know that much, really. I can't answer that question.
Charlie, I have 1 second, Nancy. I
Okay.
got one question here. What do you think of the nuclear threat?
What do I think of the nuclear threat? So far, everything we've seen is that nothing has changed in the Russian nuclear stance. These threats seem to be a lot of jawboning, okay? Something we have to take seriously, but everyone who's looked closely at it sees no change in the Russian stance. So I'm hoping it'll stay that way. Yeah.
He charges against it.
Yeah.
It's not going all the way.
Yeah.
There are lots of weapons that they have short of nuclear weapons.
Right.
Fuel air explosions, biological, chemical. Is there a likelihood that he'll make use of some of those short of nuclear activity?
So I don't know. So far, we haven't seen that happen. There is evidence that was used in Syria. Okay, they did cross a line in Syria. My guess as to whether he'd do that, I think the risk there is then he might get NATO involved, which would be a problem. My guess is no, but what are the new atrocities? That's the question before the House. What new atrocities does he commit? Yeah. I'm trying to go left or right. I'll start here. I'll get you. Yeah. Yeah. That's a nasty scenario. Maybe Moldova, maybe something. I think not. I think behind all the bluster is a realization it's not going well, and he shouldn't be giving the West more pretexts to get more involved. I teach narrative voice, and so my feeling is no. My feeling is no. Did I repeat the question?
We asked about this, the further nuclear threat. Would they take off?
Did I repeat it?
Take out? No, I don't know.
No,
if
sorry.
you did.
So the question was, how do I view the further escalation of the nuclear threat? Yeah. So, okay, yes, here.
Okay, so based on what you were talking about with Putin, do you think that he's basically taking a page out of Hitler's playbook in terms of like using charisma, using his narrative, using basic brainwashing, in a general sense, to kind of manipulate his populace in order to get them to back him? And then do you think if that is true, do you think he's from Hitler?
So, question is Putin drawing on Hitler's playbook and essentially brainwashing people into doing what he wants and his own narrative to do what he wants? So I would say this is a common approach for tyrants that he's playing on, okay, playing on very effectively. There's always an element that's sort of familiar and legitimate, part of what he says, okay? And that's where they can build on resentment. So the answer is, I think it is a tyrant's playbook to connect the dots in history in ways that suit them. Just the way we heard about Putin saying, well, Moscow was the continuation of Kyiv, right? It's not that simple. Up here, yes. Right. So question is, China's trying to get on Russia's side, right? Okay. Are you talking about, did you mention Zelensky, or talking about Russia only, right? Okay. Question is, China's more active involvement in all this with Russia, what does that mean? So the two countries have been getting closer, definitely the last 15 years, all right? I still think Russia's the weaker partner, okay? And so Russia, I'm more inclined to think Russia got into this war in part to show China too how much muscle they had, and they came up looking short. So China, from my point of view, is using this war to look like a major world player, all right? And the player that Russia needs to turn to if it's going to do better in this war. Can they get them serious military aid? I can't comment on that. That's absolutely not in my field. But this whole peace proposal that China recently offered, it's nothing more than a position paper, all right? It's nothing you can really activate. They're just trying to show they are a major world superpower. And Russia is the weaker of the two, no question. I think that's it, yeah. Yeah.
Your speech seems to cast Putin as a megalomaniac trying to resurrect to that man. But couldn't you say that this war partially answers Russia's need for the Ukrainian breadbasket and one more important?
Okay. So question is, aside from messianic aspects of all this, are there, how about the warm water port, the Ukrainian farmland, is that a factor in all this? So I'll come back to what even astonishes me, but I think he's happy to grab them if he can, but I don't think that's what's motivating this. He really buys into this narrative. Now remember, how long has this guy been in power? 23 years, okay? He is very isolated, all right? My feeling is he may be just outside of the present so much that he really thinks this mission is what he should be acting on. So, yeah, the Holy Russian Empire, as it existed once upon a time, never really existed that way. Eileen would say the same thing.
I have two quick questions
Yes.
for you online. One is the poetry anthology that you mentioned early.
Okay,
What is that?
I'll have to get you the exact title.
Okay,
I think it's
I will
something.
email them back.
Okay, good.
And then the second one is the one that I think we're all thinking about is, do you think Americans are in it for the long haul?
Ooh, so, did everyone hear those questions? Now, everyone in this, should I repeat them? Okay, okay. So, first of all, I'll get you the title of that anthology. You can read Cat Roast on your own, okay? Then, what about U.S.? U.S.'s long-term commitment to this. 2 months ago, I would have been very optimistic. I still am basically optimistic. I still feel that enough people recognize what Michael McFaul wrote about, that to allow this to happen, okay, is such an egregious stain on world order. And for Democrats around the world with a small d, all right, that I think will hang in there. Can we be there 2 or 3 years from now? When members of Congress say, well, maybe we'll fund this for another year, or we need to see a victory in the next year, I think Putin couldn't be happier to hear that, all right? So he has that advantage in terms of the long, but I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll hang in there.
Okay.
Up here? Yeah. The question is, would crimes against humanity be brought against them, and what will that mean? What can come out of that? What will be the consequences? So my guess is yes, they will. Will they be convicted? I sure hope so. What are the practical implications of that? I'm afraid negligible. I mean, look at how long we've been seeing just atrocious footage coming out of Ukraine about torture of citizens, just unimaginable things. Hasn't changed Russian strategy at all. So sorry to say, I think it should happen. I hope it does happen. I'm not sure what will change, or maybe in the post-Putin era, maybe, but who knows what that looked like.
I'm gonna close it off right now, but Charlie's gonna stay around for a little bit. Who had what are you saying, Jill? Charlie's, go ahead.
One quick question. When the war broke out, I think I was with everybody else in the world, like, this is a 1-week war. And I think Putin and I were both in agreement on that.
Right.
Well, I'm eating my thoughts, and I think Putin's eating his too.
Yeah.
So, having said that, I also projected about a year ago, and I thought the Polish girl, the resistance that happened was an outfit. And I'm trying to get enlightened with what you said about how he really dominated that whole situation across the media, and that's the way that happened. There was rumors of him having cancer and things like that. Do you see there's much chance in the next year, 2 years, of Putin being ousted by the Polish girl?
Okay, the question is there a chance in the next year or two that Putin could be ousted by somebody, either the Politburo or some other part of the apparatus? My prediction would be no. Okay, I think his control probably is as complete as what Stalin had, which is greater than what Khrushchev had, greater than what Brezhnev had. He has gone about solidifying his power very systematically and very effectively. You know, the biography of him by Gessen was The Man Without a Face. He's somebody you never saw, and yet he kept getting things done, like Stalin. Stalin, among the original Bolsheviks, was kind of like, at most, a corporate controller or almost a bouncer at a discotheque. He was not a serious intellectual or considered to be a major force. He got them all killed. He took over the apparatus and gained power. So my feeling is that's not likely. I'm young enough to be surprised, I hope.
All right. Charlie's going to stick around for a little while, so you still have questions. You can come up and talk to him. I thank you so much for coming out today. I hope you had a good time. I do represent Planned Giving, so we have a couple brochures if you're interested. They're the red brochures that a couple of you have taken already, but on the table out there, and we will be having more of these, so I look forward to seeing you again real soon. Thank you so much. Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you.